8 weeks. Only 8 more weeks until the start of the 2016-2017 National Football League regular season. And even less time until your annual fantasy football draft. So it's about that time of year to start hitting the books, or videos in this case, because this is the year your luck changes. This is the year you're finally going to win the championship, despite not even making the playoffs last year. So now you find yourself here watching an endless amount of videos on the same topic, and they all preach the same concepts. They all debate on which player to pick at whatever situation it is, or whether Julio Jones should be ranked higher than Odell Beckham or not. But your first few picks are never your team's problems. Yet you continue to watch these videos and hear hundreds of opinions from so-called experts. You go through the same routine every year, watching the same videos and going into the draft with the same strategy. Yet you expect different results. So is this year's draft preparation really different from any of the ones before? So what's the problem? How can you finally break through this year? By looking at fantasy football a different way than before. The brand new Whiteboard Sports Channel brings you a unique 8-week program, Fantasy Football Training Camp, to help you finally break through your fantasy football slump. There will be multiple episodes each week to prepare you for the first step to win your championship, and that is Draft Day. The first episode of Training Camp starts now. Let's look at fantasy football in a broad perspective. The goal is to achieve a winning record in order to make the playoffs. From there, you must win the rest of your games in order to win the championship. In order to win the championship, you must master the 3 who's of fantasy football. Who you draft, who you pick up, and who you start. The 3 who's rely on one another, but at this time, only one is important to master. Who you draft. Well, really the team you draft. A team size can vary based on the league you're in, but let's say your team will consist of 16 players, each of whom you'll draft. So you have 16 spots to fill up. So how are you going to do that? What's the strategy? Well, let's take a look at each spot. The first few spots are not to be messed with. You draft the best available player and that's final. You don't want to take any sort of risk or worry about positioning or bye week management. So how do you determine the best player out there? Or which players are considered risks? Calls for speculation, doesn't it? Not so fast. The first rule of choosing the right player is to 100% avoid player rankings. Player rankings are not real. They're based on experts attempting to predict the future by projecting the performance of players. Player rankings are pure opinion and never accurate because last time I checked, real psychics do not spend their time debating whether Julio Jones should be ranked higher than Odell Beckham or not. Therefore, you should absolutely avoid them. So what should you use? Simple. Look at last year's actual fantasy football player rankings, because this is based on actual performance, not opinion. Say a player is on the same team as last year, surrounded by the same players as last year, and performed well last year. The chances are, this player will perform well again this year. Based on this logic, you will draft several players that performed well last year and are in a similar environment as last year's as well. Easy enough. Now looking at the middle rounds, there are many ways you can go. Who you draft depends on who is available at what draft position you're in. So in this episode, we are not quite ready to dive into the middle round strategy yet, as it depends on in-draft scenarios. As draft day becomes closer, we will investigate middle round strategy for each possible draft position in our special training camp event. Think of your team as a pile of money. Well, you're going to have to budget that money, right? You need to split up that pile of money in order to pay for different expenses, like your house, your car, and food. You can use that same concept in order to manage your team by splitting up your 16 picks for each round. The early round picks will be your star players, one that consistently performs well and hopefully you don't have to worry about them much. The middle rounds are more like your role players, ones that can be substituted in and out of the starting lineup based on matchups and so forth. And then there's the late round picks. What are they for? What is their purpose? Let's review the 3 who's of fantasy football. Who you draft, who you pick up, and who you start. Drafting well in the early rounds makes the first 2 easier to master. Drafting well in the middle rounds makes the third who easier to master. So shouldn't the late round picks make The second who, or who to pick up, easier to master? Do you see the connection between the three who's now? In order to make picking players up on waivers easy to master, you need to draft players in the late rounds that you have no problem releasing. You have to go out on a limb and pick deep sleepers, as they say, where they either pay off big or quickly fail, where you can easily release them and not feel bad. Then, you can pick up another player off the waivers and try again. It's a win-win scenario for you. The later rounds, unlike the earlier rounds, are for taking risks and going with your gut, not drafting the best available player. By using this logic, your team is complete and ready to compete. In this episode, we reviewed a basic and successful outline to help you make your decisions, but we haven't discussed any specific players yet. Coming up in future episodes, we will review the best players to draft in each situation based on the logic discussed today. Think this week's episode of Fantasy Football Training Camp is over? Think again. This video may be coming to a close, but the message board is always open. Please, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, write to us in the message board and we will respond directly to you. With that said, please subscribe and tune in for our next episode coming at this time next week. See you then.